argumentation theory. So it's my privilege to have the opportunity to discuss my work with you. So what I would like to talk to you about today is the connection between virtue, legal reasoning, and judicial ethics. And this is part of a book in progress in which I'm working on now, which aims to apply virtue jurisprudence to legal reasoning and draw some conclusions of the virtue term in legal reasoning for judicial ethics. It's great, really a great opportunity for me to be able to discuss what I hope will be the main tenets that I am hoping to develop further in this book manuscript. The topic of this talk and the way in which I'm going to approach it is as I said, meant to be a contribution to virtue jurisprudence, so aiming to apply virtue jurisprudence to legal argumentation. So what is virtue jurisprudence? For those of you who are not familiar with the field, virtue jurisprudence is an approach to law and adjudication that aims at situating the notion of virtue at the center of legal theorizing. It's in an emergent paradigm of legal analysis that is meant to be an alternative or a complement, depending on how strong a position is in virtue jurisprudence, either an alternative or a complement to more traditional approaches to legal argument that are either consequentialist or deontological. So views of legal reasoning that understand legal reasoning mostly as a matter of rule application, so according to which legal reasoning will be basically reasoning with rules, on the one hand, and on the other hand, approaches to legal reasoning that focus much more on outcomes or consequences, so consequentialist approaches to legal reasoning. So in between these two views, that are the traditional ways in which legal argument has been understood, virtue jurisprudence aims at addressing the problems inherent to legal reasoning in virtue terms, understanding the idea of virtue as a central notion in a theory of legal reasoning. By virtues, what do I mean? So there are several ways in which this can be understood, but I'm particularly interested in the role that virtues understood as traits of character play in a theory of legal reasoning, not so much in terms of faculties or capacities. So I'm not trying or aiming to apply externalist views of virtue or reliabilist approaches to virtue, but I'm more interested in applying to law the traditional Aristotelian idea of virtue as a character trait. The reason why this is my main interest will probably become apparent by the end of the talk, but mainly is because unlike reliable faculties, character traits that according to Aristotle are virtues, and in the Aristotelian and Neo-Aristotelian tradition has been understood as virtues, are traits that we can be responsible for developing. And because I'm much more interested in legal education and ways in which we can improve legal reasoning and practices of legal argumentation, this is why this is the focus. Not so much because I believe, which I don't, that the other account of virtue has no role to play in law. This approach to law and adjudication virtue jurisprudence has been emerging in the last decades, but this is not to say that it is a novel approach, in fact. In fact, virtue and accounts of law in terms of virtue or accounts of law that give virtue a prominent place have been the traditional way since ancient philosophy of approaching legal problems. So virtue jurisprudence should not be understood as a novel way of analyzing law, but rather as recovering or redeploying a traditional understanding of the law as tied up to notions of virtue in contemporary, in the conditions of the contemporary society. So it's more a movement of recovery, of vindication of a strain of thought or a way of thinking about the law that was, in my view, unduly marginalized in contemporary legal theorizing. So virtue jurisprudence has been applied to very many different fields, most prominently criminal law, but not only. So there have been also virtue approaches to constitutional law, to torts law, to reflection about the ends of law. So what I'm more interested in doing here and also in the book is trying to see what will be the implications of a virtue term in a theory of legal argumentation. So there are two main reasons why I think that virtue is a core concept in a theory of legal argumentation. The first reason is that if we situate the notion of virtue at the center of a theory of legal argumentation, we are able to see or to bring to light the relevance of some dimensions of legal argument that have been marginalized or obliterated by traditional approaches to the subject. And the second reason why I think it is important to turn to virtue when discussing legal argumentation is because it allows us to see the extent to which a theory of legal reasoning on the one hand and a theory of judicial ethics or professional legal ethics on the other hand are not two separate disciplines, but that there are very important connections between theories of legal reasoning and professional legal ethics. So these are the two main claims that I aim to discuss with you in this talk. To repeat, the idea that turning to virtue allows us to see some important dimensions, neglected dimensions of legal argument, and it also allows us to see important connections between theories of legal argumentation on the one hand and theories of professional ethics on the other. So I start then with the elements of legal reasoning that are brought to the surface when approaching the subject of the theory of legal reasoning through the lenses of virtue theory. What are those elements? So these are five of them. There are five important dimensions of legal argument that I think are sidestep by standard theories of legal reasoning and the importance of which are brought to light when examining legal reasoning with the tools of virtue theory. The first one is the fact that legal reasoning is first and foremost reasoning about the particulars. So there is, in fact, because most standard theories of legal reasoning focus on the role that rules play in legal reasoning and understand legal argument as a rule-based argument, there is an extreme focus on on the general pole of legal reasoning, to the detriment of the relevance that the particulars of the case play when reasoning about the law. So the idea here is that when one possesses and exercises the virtues, one has a knowledge of exceptions. The person who has the virtues is endowed with a capacity of a higher capacity of situational appreciation that allows the person to see whether there are some reasons in the particular case that may even lead to question the applicability of the relevant rule. In that sense, virtue theory, insofar as virtue is a capacity to perceive the particulars, since Aristotle, allow us to focus more on the particularistic pole of legal reasoning, which has not been the predominant focus of standard theories of legal reasoning. This is not to say, and I wouldn't like to argue at all, that particularism is the way to go straightforwardly in legal reasoning. To the contrary, I mean, what I'm trying to do is to redress a balance between the highly generalist picture of legal reasoning and what could arguably be defended as a particularistic approach, and claim that vindicate that there is a middle way in between these two extreme approaches, which is the one provided by a virtue theory. So the virtues deliberator in law, the virtues judge, for instance, is not someone obviously who's going to disregard the rule and merely assess the case in its own merits. Is someone who is also loyal to the law, as I will explain later, and to the extent that it is so, it it's going to give to reasons from authority, to reasons based on the applicable legal rules, a weight in structuring the deliberation, but it's also alert to unexpected features of the situation which might question the applicability of the rule. So we might want to say perhaps that the person who has the virtues, in fact, what has is an ability to detect whether there are defeating conditions, conditions such that defeat the applicability of the relevant legal rule. And to reason properly in the legal context, one should be able not only, as has been emphasized so much, not only give reasons from authority a role, but also be ready to detect or have the capacity to detect whether there are some features in the case that might lead to perhaps reinterpret the rule in a different way, or find out ways in which within the legal constraints we might be able to resolve more satisfactorily the case than merely by applying what seems to be the straightforward applicable rule. The second way, in addition to focusing on particulars, that a virtual approach to legal reasoning brings to light is the important perceptual dimension of legal argument. Most theories of legal reasoning, standard theories of legal reasoning, focus mostly on the reflection and the role that deliberation and reflection play in legal reasoning. So they focus mostly on what we all know are system 2 types of reasoning, to the detriment of system 1. So perception is hardly discussed in theories of legal reasoning, and it plays nevertheless a very important role in reasoning properly in legal context. Because virtue endows the person who has it with, as I said, a perceptual capacity to detect potential defeaters to applicable rules, to detect the features of the situation that demand attention of the particular case. It involves the possession of a refined perceptual capacity, and in fact, a perceptual model of a virtue has been a very popular model in ethics, particularly championed by John McDowell, but not only. And it has also made its way into theories of legal argument. I think it is very important, and it's a very important and welcome consequence of applying virtue theory to law, that it allows us to see the extent to which perception is involved when reasoning about legal cases, which are therefore not only a matter of deliberating explicitly or consciously about the case, but there is also, one has to engage these perceptual abilities in order to reason properly in legal cases. However, I wouldn't like to defend straightforwardly a perceptual model of virtue, because there are some reasons that make it less than ideal, and there are particularly reasons why introducing it in the legal context has some undesirable implications. First of all, in law, there is an important constraint that judges particularly, but in fact all legal officials should abide by, which is the requirement of providing and giving reasons in support of one's decisions. And if this is the case, it cannot be that virtue is like a mysterious ability that helps the person who has it to see into the right, that admits of no discursive justification. I cannot, as a judge, obviously say, well, you know, this is the right decision. Why? Because I say so. That's obviously in our democratic liberal societies, this is not acceptable. The person who, the virtuous judge, if virtuous, will have to be able to provide reasons for their decisions. And understanding virtue as mere perception precludes providing these reasons, and therefore precludes complying with the requirement of giving reasons in support of one's decisions that is critical in law. Secondly, it is at odds with the phenomenology of judging. I'm focusing on judges, which is in fact, the focus of my work on virtue, but the argument could be generalized to other professional roles as well. It is at odds with the phenomenology of judging because, as we know from judges' reports as well as jurors, for instance, legal reasoning is everything but easy. It doesn't come like perceiving into the right in this with the immediacy and the facility that the perceptual model of virtue pretends that is the case. In fact, what we know about the phenomenology of judging or the phenomenology of reasoning about legal cases is that it is, even for the best, the very best judges, still an arduous and difficult interpretative exercise and an arduous and difficult task. And to the extent that this is so, it doesn't seem that the model of virtue as a perception, so the perceptual model of virtue defended by McDowell and others, is appropriate to give an account of the phenomenological dimensions of legal argument. In many theories of legal reasoning, the phenomenological aspects are not taken into account, but I think it is important to take into account, and it tells against a theory of argumentation the fact that it doesn't fit with the way in which making arguments, receiving arguments, engaging in argumentation is experienced by those who are in the practice. And the third reason why I think this perceptual model is inappropriate is because it makes it difficult or a mystery how one could ever acquire the skills necessary to reason properly about legal cases. It seems that virtue is something then that either is like a sixth sense, that either one has it or one doesn't, and it becomes difficult to even start thinking about how this capacity could start being communicated and transferred to others, or how others could become virtues. And this is a problem because it makes virtue theory vulnerable to an objection that is very appealing to many, according to which the virtue theory is elitist, and it makes virtue the province of a few, and therefore has like quite undemocratic implications. So instead of understanding virtue or judicial virtue as a perceptual capacity, I suggest that we follow Julia Annas and others, in particularly her view, I find it particularly attractive, in claiming that virtue is best understood by analogy with a practical skill. Understanding this skill model of virtue does not have the three problems that the perceptual one faces. It makes it clear the way in which having the virtues of being a virtuous deliberator will enable one to provide reasons, because experts, of course, are not those that shrug their shoulders when asked, an expert in a laboratory, for instance, why do you change this? Why do you have to conduct another test? Or an expert in wines, why this wine is better than another one? The expert in a practical skill will be able to tell you what are the reasons why this wine is better than this other one, or why it is the appropriate moment to stop this test and conduct another one. So in that sense, the practice of providing reasons becomes the backbone, in fact, of a virtuous practice. And secondly, it fits well with the phenomenology of judging, in the sense that for the expert, many things come about easy, and particularly things that will be difficult for the novice are easy for the expert, but this doesn't mean that there are no cases which will be challenging even for the expert. What differences, or what the difference between the expert and the novice will be that, unlike the novice, the expert has the tools to actually address these very challenging cases. But nevertheless, these are cases in which deliberation is not ocioso, in which the virtuous person has to engage and all his capacities, and has to make a conscious effort to resolve. And finally, it also gives us a very nice model for how one can transition from being a novice to being a virtuous person, the model of expertise. Because we do know a lot about how expertise is acquired, and many of those insights can be translated into virtue acquisition. Therefore, an approach to legal reasoning that situates the idea of virtue at the center brings to light the extent to which perception is an important part of legal argument without reducing the bulk of legal reasoning to a mere exercise of a perceptual capacity. The third element, in addition to the attention to the particulars and the perception that a virtual approach to legal reasoning help us see, is the relevance that emotions play in legal reasoning. Typically, and not only for those who are not in law, I'm sure that for many of you who are not in the legal domain, the law is everything but passion. One does not typically associate emotions with the arid domain of legal argument, except when it comes, to this, to watching movies about how jurors are impacted by but very skillful lawyers who trigger their emotions. But typically, when it comes what is supposed to be a good legal argument, is one that is not pregnant with emotion. That is the accepted standard view, which I think misses a lot of what is going on in legal argument. Emotions play a critical role in good, sound legal argument. They play a variety of roles. I will only like to mention one of the roles that I think is particularly important, which is the epistemic role that virtues play. The virtues allow the emotions play, Emotions allow to detect aspects of the situation that will have gone unnoticed by someone who didn't have the appropriate emotional dispositions. For instance, a sense of indignation on a judge can make her detect aspects of the situation or avenues or forms of solving the problem that will have gone undetected by a more dispassionate distance look at the problem. A virtue theory, even though one can vindicate the role that the emotions play in legal argument without endorsing or committing oneself to a virtue approach to legal reasoning, I think it is an advantage of virtuous approaches to legal reasoning that they have a natural place for emotions. So it's very easy to account for the role that emotions play in legal argument by advocating within a virtue approach to legal argument, because virtues, as is well known since Aristotle, are not only a matter of action, but also a matter of emotion. So virtue is a compound of both cognitive and affective components, and this makes it particularly well fit to give an account of the role that emotions play in legal reasoning. The fourth element that a virtue approach to legal reasoning brings to light is the importance that the description of the case, the description of the situation of choice, how important it is for conducting and discharging the decision-making tasks in the context of the law properly. Standard theories of legal reasoning focus on the moment of choice, on the moment in which we have several alternatives, several decisions that could possibly be justified within the constraints imposed by the legal materials, and then the problem becomes one of justifying the selection of one among these several justifiable options. However, before the moment of choice, there is a critical moment of description of the problem of choice. And even though I wouldn't go as far as to say with Iris Murdoch that if one describes in this beautiful, beautiful book, The Sovereignty of Good, in the essay, The Idea of Perfection, that is just a beautiful piece of writing, Iris Murdoch goes as far as saying that if one describes the case finely and effectively, and with a loving gaze, then by the end of this very fine description, there is no choice to be made. I think this is perhaps a bit too much, and it will it is too extreme a view, and it will turn legal decision making into a kind of empirical investigation. But even if we don't accept such an extreme view of the role that description plays in legal argument, I think it is important to emphasize the extent to which description and choice are both important aspects of legal reasoning, and that we should not put the emphasis, as is customarily the case, exclusively on the moment of choice, but also in the moment of description. The virtuous person, insofar as has this very refined perceptual capacity, is well positioned to pay due attention to the several reasons that obtain in the particular case, and reflect about the values that are involved. There is a connection in the description. It's not merely the description of the facts, it's also the description of what are the values that are involved at stake in the particular case. So a good description, which the virtuous person is best positioned to make, is one that will intertwine both facts and values. Sometimes a good description requires having a good set, a good developed conception of the values at stake. For instance, we might think that in cases of sexual harassment, for example, the fact that there is an asymmetry of power between the accused and the victim, one would think that this is an important part of describing the case properly. It's not the same whether the purportedly sexual harassment has occurred between people who are equal in power than between people who, among which there is an asymmetry of power. And it takes sometimes a virtuous eye to realize that this is a relevant feature that should figure in a good description of the case. In fact, in the way in which the law evolved, it was first of all a judicial finding that sexual harassment cases, the fact that asymmetry of power is an important factor that has to be taken into account in the description of the case, and then it was codified in legal rules, making it an element of the description of the offense. When I mean description, I'm not meaning purely empirical investigation. I have in mind also a good description of the values involved and the way in which those values impinge in a good description of the facts of the case. The fifth aspect that a virtue approach to legal reasoning brings to light is the relevance of specificatory patterns of reasoning in the context of judicial reasoning, at the very least. So legal reasoning cannot be understood as merely as an instrumentalist kind of reasoning, in which we have some main ends that we aim to achieve and that are fixed and beyond the scope of deliberation. And what we need to do is to select the decision that help us best advance those previously conceived aims. On the contrary, oftentimes, and this is clearly the case about rights, in cases about rights, for instance, fundamental rights, but not only. I think it's in fact a common situation, one in which the case involves a number of different conflicting values that are incommensurable and that make a distinctive contribution of a good life, and that cannot simply be measured one against the other or be brought together on a single scale so that we will pick the decision that is highest in a score. I think you might find that this couldn't possibly be the case, but as it turns out, this is a way in which legal reasoning has been, and popular approaches to legal reasoning has understood the way in which one should resolve the cases in which there is a conflict among values. For instance, in Alexis' very famous wage formula, I don't know whether you're familiar with it, this is in fact what is behind the formula, the idea that one has different values or fundamental rights that conflict against each other, and then we should be able to brought them and measure one up against the other on a common scale, and pick the solution that has the highest score, so to say. On a virtuous approach, this is not the way to go when it comes to conflict, to normative conflict, and resolving the very many cases which involve normative conflict in law. Since, at least in some interpretations of Aristotle, practical reasoning is first and foremost the searching for the best specification of the values involved. And this is the way in which, in the tradition of virtue ethics, a virtuous deliberator will approach normative conflict, not by weigh and balance, or by reducing the different values to a single scale, but rather by specifying the different values that are at stake and trying to achieve the most coherent theory about how these values should be understood and how they relate to each other. So specificatory forms of reasoning, and there are like several ways in which specificatory arguments could be understood, but broadly, specificatory forms of reasoning are central to legal practice in a way in which perhaps has not been emphasized sufficiently in standard instrumentalist approaches to legal argumentation. So the first claim is then that a virtue term in legal argumentation help us to see the extent to which legal reasoning is perhaps a much more complex type of argument, a much more complex practice than it is usually, than the way in which it is usually portrayed in standard approaches to the subject of legal reasoning. It is not merely a matter of the general, but also the particular, not only a matter of reflection, but also of perception, not only cognition, but also emotion, not only description, not only choice, but also description. And it's not only a matter of means ends type of reasoning, but it's also a matter of reasoning about ends. So it is much more complex than perhaps it has been portrayed as being. And in this alternative picture, virtue-based picture of legal reasoning, the agent figures at the center of the theory. A sound legal argument necessitates an agent that has the perceptual abilities, the emotional capacities required to discern the particulars, so as to reach a good description of the case that is responsive to the different values involved and the way in which these different values relate to each other. So learning how to reason better or improving one's reasoning capacities about the law requires also developing a certain type of character. And this is where the second claim that I announced in the beginning of the talk becomes relevant. From a virtue perspective, the theories of legal reasoning are not disconnected or unrelated to theories of legal ethics or to theories of judicial ethics. And the reason why this is so is because if legal reasoning is as complex as I have portrayed, as I have described, and if in this very complex approach to what legal reasoning involves, the virtuous agent is at the center, the virtuous judge or the virtuous lawyer or prosecutor is at the center of the enterprise of legal reasoning, and being able to reason in these ways requires having this type of emotional, perceptual capacities, etc., that virtue endows its possessor with, then it is the case that one needs to build a virtuous moral character in order to be able to reason properly about legal cases. So it is not a matter only of becoming a good person or becoming or complying with the standards of the professional legal ethics, the standards that regulate the profession. Is rather that one is not able to reason properly about legal cases given the moral dimensions of legal argument and the special characteristics that legal argument has, unless one has a certain type of moral character. So what is this type of virtue? What are those? What is the type of character that enables one to reason properly about legal cases, to be a good legal arguer? Well, I will only briefly mention those. Not so much a list of the virtues as a suggestion about how the different types of character, what are the different types of character traits that are relevant to becoming a good, a virtuous deliberator, a virtuous legal reasoner. In most theories of legal ethics, virtues do not play a role because, as I said, it's consequentialist on the one hand and deontological Kantian approaches on the other that are mostly principle-dependent views, in fact, that are typically invoked in studies of professional legal ethics and especially judicial ethics. To the extent that virtues are brought to the table, they are mostly focused on moral virtues, which are central indeed. So one important, but not the only ones, and this is my main claim. So an important part of becoming a virtuous or acquiring a virtuous judicial character has to do with acquiring the moral virtues such as honesty, magnanimity, or courage, for instance. But beyond that, virtuous judicial character requires possessing and exercising also different types of traits that are not typically understood, that are not moral virtues, such as intellectual or epistemic virtues like open-mindedness, perseverance, intellectual vitality, intellectual sobriety, or intellectual autonomy. In addition to moral and epistemic virtues, the virtuous judge should also have what Hume called the artificial virtues. So the virtue of loyalty is paramount, and it is in fact crystallized in the judicial oath. So the virtuous judge should be loyal to the law. And also the virtue of justice, which is, as the great legal theorist H.L. Hart said, the most important of the judicial virtues, and a virtue that is particularly the most juridical of the virtues, and a virtue that is particularly appropriate to law. Whatever other virtues a judge will have, it seems even a contradiction in terminis to say he is a virtuous judge but an unjust one. So the virtue of justice has a very important role to play in defining the ideal of the virtuous judge. In addition to moral virtues, intellectual or epistemic virtues, and the artificial virtues, it's also important that judges have, well, Daniel and Andrew have done so much in fleshing out and theorizing the argumentative virtues. So virtues such as the willingness to question the obvious, or the willingness to change one's positions are, this set of virtues are also critical to engaging successfully in legal practice. A fourth type of virtues that virtuous judges should possess are group deliberative virtues. And these are virtues that have received scant attention in the literature that has focused mostly in the individual judge. However, many legal decisions, and certainly the most important legal decisions, are taken by collective bodies. And to the extent that this is so, it is critical that judges possess, and not only judges, I mean, members of regulatory bodies, of legislative commissions. So many important legal decisions are taken by collective agents, and to the extent that this is so, it is important that judges and other legal officials have the virtues that are conducive to good group deliberation. And finally, there is a virtue that is the crown of all, so to speak, a meta virtue, the virtue of phronesis, or practical wisdom, that helps arbitrate conflicts between the virtues and helps detect the mean in context that the virtue consists of. So judges who have all these different types of virtues, to a large degree, a large share of those virtues to a high degree, are exemplary judges, and are those that are in fact well positioned to make and take exemplary decisions. So to sum up, a virtue approach to legal reasoning puts in place a more complex view of legal reasoning than it is traditionally the case in standard theories of legal reasoning, and brings to light the connections that legal reasoning has with theories of judicial ethics. So when we want to make progress about how to best reason in law, we also need to make progress in a better understanding what are the traits of character that make a judge a better judge. So there are very important connections and cross-fertilizations between these two different types of research. So a final word just to close and to dispel perhaps some skeptical doubts that some of you might have, I guess. That this is very idealistic. This is so removed from the reality of the courtroom and so removed, so deprived of practical implications that this, even it is a nice and rosy picture of how legal reasoning should be, but just too disconnected to how things in reality are. However, I want to conclude by vindicating the practical implications that a virtual approach to legal reasoning has. Far from being a sterile, unproductive idealization, I think that paying attention to the role that virtue plays in legal reasoning has very important practical implications in two realms. On the one hand, in legal education. Because if we think that learning the practice of legal argument involves much more than learning how to make well an argument from analogy or how to become good at deductive reasoning, it involves cultivating a certain type of character, then this is going to have an important impact on legal education. And there are several ways in which we can educate in the virtues. Perhaps in the discussion some of those will come up, and a lot of empirical and interesting theoretical work as well in pedagogy particularly that we could bring home with a view to developing the curricula and the professional capacitation of judges and other legal officials with a view to instilling virtuous traits of character. And the second implication it has to do with institutional design. Even if we cannot become virtuous overnight, and even if a judge cannot just by taking a course on virtue theory become a virtuous person over the course of, I don't know, a fortnight, still there is much that we can do in terms of designing legal institutions and designing legal procedures with a view to fostering virtue and promoting a virtuous behavior among legal officials. There are several ways in which we can, so to speak, nudge virtue, and this might also orient ways in which we can think of revising, rethinking legal rules, legal procedures, and more generally designing legal institutions and legal organizations. So I think that a virtual approach to theories of legal reasoning not only help us understand better what it requires, what is it required to actually engage successfully in legal argument, but also has, at a theoretical level, but also has important practical implications. So, well, thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thanks.